Hey guys, welcome to The Last Climb. And in this video, you'll see what happened when four gym bros decided they didn't need a Sherpa on Mount Everest.
Confident in their shredded physiques, they ignored people who were practically screaming for them to turn back. What Everest did to them was so brutally unforgiving that you'll never look at a mountain trail the same way again. It was May 18, 2017. South Col, Mount Everest, 26,000 feet above sea level. Four guys, fit, experienced, confident, are lying in a tent on the highest col in the world. They have functioning gear. They have sleeping bags rated for this temperature. They have a stove, food, water, and oxygen. Every piece of equipment they needed to survive the night was within arm's reach, but that didn't matter. Sota Ito was 29 years old, a software developer from San Jose who had gotten serious about mountaineering in his mid-20s after burning out from years of long hours in the tech industry. Friends described him as disciplined and analytical, the kind of person who researched every purchase and planned every trip down to the smallest detail. Climbing had become his way of imposing order on a life that often felt dominated by screens and deadlines. He wasn't reckless. In fact, he considered himself cautious.
I want you to keep in mind that self-image would become important later, because it made it easier for him to interpret warnings as things meant for less prepared people.
Anatoly Yudin was 31, a structural engineer from Denver with a background in competitive weightlifting and a reputation in his climbing circle for being methodical to the point of stubbornness. He approached mountains the way he approached engineering projects. Identify variables, build a plan, execute it. The system either worked or it didn't. His confidence came less from ego than from a genuine belief that preparation solved most problems. If someone challenged a decision he had already spent weeks researching, his instinct was to defend it rather than reconsider it. At lower elevations, that mindset had often served him well. Henry O'Sullivan was 28, originally from outside Boston, the quietest of the four and the one least likely to dominate a conversation. He worked in commercial real estate and had only discovered mountaineering a few years earlier through Mateo. Unlike the others, he was never particularly interested in the technical side of climbing. What he loved was the sense of achievement that came from reaching places most people would never see. He trusted his friends, especially Sota and Anatoly, and rarely challenged group decisions. In a different team, surrounded by more experienced high-altitude climbers, he probably would have listened carefully and adapted.
Here, he mostly followed the momentum of the group. Now, I think we all have this type of friend.
Matteo Neri was 30, an Italian-American personal trainer from Chicago who had talked the other three into their first high-altitude climb 3 years earlier. Charismatic and energetic, he was the social center of the group, the person constantly proposing new goals before the previous one was fully finished. To clients, he represented discipline and self-improvement. To friends, he represented ambition. Everest appealed to him for the same reason marathon runners sign up for harder races after finishing their first one. Once a challenge becomes achievable, it stops feeling impossible. He never viewed the mountain casually, but he increasingly viewed it as something that could be mastered through commitment and physical conditioning. These were not couch athletes. These were guys who trained seriously, took altitude seriously as a concept, and had actually done the work of climbing two of the world's most demanding, non-technical peaks. They summited Kilimanjaro 19,341 feet using a guide service. They followed that up with Aconcagua in Argentina, 22,841 feet, again with guides. Those are real climbs. Those numbers are real altitude.
And that experience is part of what made what came next so hard for me to know, because their prior successes were doing a lot of the convincing for them.
When they decided to attempt Everest, they made a decision that would define everything that followed. They were going to do it without Sherpa guides.
Now, before I continue, I have to note that in 2017, this was not illegal.
Nepal's permit regulations at the time did not mandate Sherpas support the way they would later tighten up, so on paper, they were cleared. And their reasoning, at least as they explained it to other climbers and expedition teams at base camp, was not as simple as arrogance. They framed it as a philosophical choice. They wanted to climb it clean. They believed they knew their bodies at altitude. They trusted their own judgment.
I know. To a layperson, that sounds pretty reasonable.
But to anyone who had spent serious time above 26,000 feet,
it sounded like two things being confused for one thing.
Fitness and high-altitude mountaineering competence are not the same skill set. Knowing how your body handles 19,000 feet with guides does not tell you how it will handle 29,000 feet without them. The mountain that sits between those two data points is not a straight line. It is a completely different category of problem. But they weren't asking for opinions anymore by the time they hit base camp. The four of them arrived at Everest Base Camp in early May 2017, a few weeks before the main summit window typically opens. Base camp at that time of year is a small city of tents, a constant rotation of expeditions, logistics coordinators, Sherpa teams, and veteran guides who have been doing this for decades.
It is also, if you're paying attention, a place where good information is freely available and openly shared.
The first round of advice came informally, from Nepali officials processing their permits. The language was procedural, but the message was clear. Unguided ascents above 8,000 meters carry significantly elevated risk, and the fatality rate for parties without experienced Sherpa support is measurably higher. This wasn't presented as a dramatic warning or an attempt to discourage them from climbing. It was simply information that officials had repeated countless times before, drawn from years of accident reports, rescue operations, and fatality statistics. Climbers attempting Everest without Sherpa support have fewer resources available when conditions change, fewer experienced eyes evaluating decisions, and less margin for error when something goes wrong high on the mountain. The four of them listened, acknowledged the information, and moved on. To them, it sounded less like a warning about their specific expedition and more like the standard risk language that surrounds every major Himalayan climb. The second round came from other expedition leaders at base camp. One of them was a veteran guide named Mark Haynes, a man with multiple Everest summits and a reputation for being direct without being aggressive. He approached them early on and offered what he called shared logistics assistance, essentially the ability to coordinate with his team on scheduling, route conditions, and oxygen management above 26,000 feet. He was not trying to sell them anything. He was doing what experienced guides do when they see a situation that concerns them. Soda tended to run point in these conversations. He was polite, he thanked Mark, he explained that they had their systems set up and planned to manage independently. He never came across as dismissive or openly arrogant. If anything, his confidence sounded measured, which made it harder for people to challenge. He spoke as someone who believed the relevant decisions had already been made weeks earlier during planning and preparation, and that what remained was simply execution. From his perspective, accepting outside assistance would have meant changing a system they had already committed to. Anatoly, when he got involved, was more technical about it. He talked about their acclimatization schedule, oxygen planning, turnaround times, and gear choices as though the conversation was a debate he was prepared to win. He always seemed to have an answer ready, another statistic, another explanation, another reason why their approach made sense. The problem wasn't that his points were completely unreasonable. Many of them were factually correct in isolation. What concerned more experienced climbers was the certainty with which he presented them. High-altitude mountaineering has a way of punishing people who believe every variable can be accounted for ahead of time. Matteo mostly listened. As the most outwardly confident member of the group, people often expected him to dominate these discussions, but he usually let Soda and Anatoly handle the details. He would occasionally nod along or add a brief comment about how much preparation they had done, but he seemed content to let the others make the case. Henry mostly agreed with whatever Soda said. He rarely challenged decisions and rarely volunteered a different opinion. The dynamic was subtle but noticeable. Soda framed the plan, Anatoly defended it, Matteo endorsed it, and Henry followed along. By that point,
I think it's not hard to tell that the four had spent enough time reinforcing one another's assumptions that outside perspectives were having less and less influence.
The offers continued through the early weeks. Each time, the answer was some version of no. And at some point, investigators and other expedition members noted this in the aftermath. They stopped engaging with outside input altogether. Not rudely, they just stopped responding to it as useful information and started treating it as background noise. The warnings, at a certain point, stopped registering as specific concern and started blending into the generic risk language that gets thrown around at altitude all the time. By the time they were moving toward Camp 2, experienced teams had quietly adjusted their own schedules to reduce overlap with the group. It wasn't a social conflict. It was a practical calculation. Their pacing was inconsistent. Their decision-making at lower camps had already shown hesitation patterns that more experienced climbers recognized as early signs of impaired judgment.
I mean, I don't blame them. I also wouldn't want to be operationally tied to a team that was becoming unpredictable.
The isolation that followed wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it mattered.
Now here's something I think doesn't get enough attention in how people talk about high altitude mountaineering deaths.
Most of the fatal mistakes don't happen near the summit. They happen weeks earlier, in decisions that compound slowly and invisibly until the margin for error is gone. On Everest, a proper acclimatization rotation looks something like this. You go up to an intermediate camp, you spend time there, you come back down to base camp to let your body recover and adapt, and then you go up again, slightly higher, and repeat. Your body, specifically your blood, is slowly learning to carry oxygen more efficiently in an environment where there isn't enough of it. This process takes time, and you cannot shortcut it with fitness. The four of them compress their rotations. The specifics are reconstructed from the Himalayan database records and from what other teams observed in terms of their camp timing. They cut rest time at intermediate camps and reduce the number of full recovery days at base camp between rotations. The cumulative effect of this is something that's hard to feel in real time because it builds gradually. You feel worse each time you go up, but the feeling is close enough to normal altitude discomfort that it's easy to rationalize. Headaches, fatigue, a little mental fog. All of that is normal at altitude.
Well, until you realize that all of it is also what early hypoxia looks like.
By the time they reached Camp 4 on the South Col on May 18th, which sits at 25,919 feet above sea level, all four of them were already starting from behind. They were hypoxic. They were cognitively slowed. And they had just climbed to one of the most hostile environments on the surface of the planet, in a condition that made every subsequent decision harder to make correctly. None of this was particularly unusual in isolation. Climbers arriving at Camp 4 are expected to be exhausted, uncomfortable, and operating under severe physiological stress. But experienced teams work hard to minimize those deficits before a summit push, because they understand how little room for error exists above 8,000 meters. The four of them arrived carrying accumulated fatigue from compressed acclimatization, rotations, and reduced recovery time, which meant they were beginning the most dangerous phase of the expedition with fewer physical and mental reserves than they should have had. In practical terms, that meant slower thinking, poorer judgment, and a reduced ability to recognize problems as they developed. On a mountain where small mistakes can become fatal ones in a matter of hours, that loss of margin mattered. They knew they felt bad. They interpreted it as expected. That interpretation was the first link in the chain. The South Col is a flat, windswept saddle between Everest and Lhotse, and it is one of the most brutal places on Earth to spend a night.
The altitude alone puts you in what mountaineers call the death zone.
Above 8,000 meters, where the human body is actively dying faster than it can recover, where every hour you spend is a net loss. Temperatures on the night of May 18th dropped to around negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind at the Col is relentless and unforgiving. Experienced teams at Camp 4 operate with a discipline that feels almost ritualistic because the environment demands it. Ventilation is managed carefully. Stoves are used in vestibules, the small anteroom area of a tent, rather than in the main sleeping compartment, specifically to prevent combustion byproducts from accumulating where people breathe. Carbon monoxide detectors, while not universal across all expeditions in 2017, were carried by a number of teams precisely because the combination of a sealed tent and a running stove at altitude is a known and documented risk. The four of them had a camping stove, a widely used and respected piece of equipment in normal conditions. At sea level, such stoves typically burn cleanly and efficiently. At 26,000 feet, however, they are operating in an environment where there is roughly a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Combustion at that oxygen level is often incomplete. Incomplete combustion produces carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is colorless and odorless. It does not irritate your airways. It does not make you cough or trigger an obvious physical alarm. What it does is bind to the hemoglobin in your red blood cells, the same hemoglobin that is supposed to carry oxygen to your brain and organs, and it binds to it roughly 250 times more effectively than oxygen does. So instead of your blood carrying oxygen to keep you alive, it starts carrying carbon monoxide and the oxygen gets crowded out. At altitude, your blood is already oxygen deprived. The combination of altitude hypoxia and carbon monoxide exposure does not add together linearly. It multiplies. The impairment arrives faster, and the symptoms, confusion, sleepiness, headache, nausea, overlap almost perfectly with the symptoms of altitude sickness, which is what everyone at Camp 4 already expects to feel. Based on the physical evidence recovered from the tent and the investigation that followed, investigators pieced together the most plausible sequence of events. They had set up their main tent with reduced ventilation because of the wind exposure. This is understandable on its face. The wind at the South Col that night was severe, and reducing airflow meant reducing heat loss. But it also meant that the air inside the tent was exchanging with outside air much more slowly than it should have been. When they needed to melt snow for water, they did it inside the main tent rather than in the vestibule. This was almost certainly a convenience decision, possibly also a wind avoidance decision. But it meant the stove was running inside the sleeping space, producing carbon monoxide in an environment where the gas had nowhere to go. Around 8 in the evening, all 4 of them would have been feeling it. Headache is usually the first symptom, a dull, persistent pressure that sits behind the eyes and across the forehead. At Camp 4, after a hard day of climbing with an already compressed acclimatization schedule, a headache is not a red flag. It is Tuesday. Every climber at that altitude has a headache. Dizziness is next, a slight unsteadiness or a sense that the world isn't quite tracking right. Then nausea. Based on what investigators could piece together from the evidence, including fragments recovered from Matteo Neri's phone, this appears to be approximately when symptoms became noticeable to all 4 of them. And based on everything they knew and believed about altitude, they diagnosed it correctly within the framework they had, which was the wrong framework. Altitude fatigue, dehydration, the expected cost of being where they were. There is no reason to believe anyone in that tent panicked. The evidence suggests the opposite, a calm, organized group settling in for what they expected to be an uncomfortable but manageable night before a summit push. Soda would have been the one to frame it that way. Anatoly would have agreed based on his read of the technical situation. Matteo had gone quieter than usual through the afternoon and evening. Henry fell asleep early, which everyone else would have read as exhaustion from the day. Nobody connected the dots. And without a carbon monoxide detector, a piece of equipment that costs less than $100 and fits in a jacket pocket, there was no way to know what the dots were. As temperatures dropped further into the night, the cold became the next problem. -20 Fahrenheit is not a temperature you sleep through comfortably, even in the best sleeping gear money can buy. At some point during the evening, based on the stove's position and fuel usage reconstructed by the investigation, they restarted the stove inside the tent for warmth. This is the decision that investigators most clearly identified as the point of no return. A tent that is already accumulating carbon monoxide for people who are already hypoxic and cognitively impaired. A stove running for warmth in an enclosed space with limited ventilation. The carbon monoxide concentration in that tent would have been climbing steadily from the moment the stove first ran, and now it was climbing faster. The cognitive effects of carbon monoxide poisoning are grimly self-reinforcing. The more impaired you become, the less capable you are of recognizing that you are impaired. The less capable you are of making the decision to open the tent, turn off the stove, get outside. The gas does not announce itself. It just makes you slower, quieter, and then very, very sleepy. Mark Haynes and his expedition were camped approximately 30 meters away. 30 meters at the South Col in the dark and in the wind is not a short distance. It is a significant gap in visibility and audibility. But one of Mark's Sherpas, a man named Pasang, was outside around 10:30 or 10:45 in the evening and noticed something that didn't sit right. The details here come from Mark's account, which was documented in the aftermath. Pasang observed irregular light patterns from the tent, consistent with a stove being used inside the main compartment rather than a vestibule, and reduced airflow from the tent's ventilation points. I'm guessing that for someone who had spent years on this mountain, the combination of those 2 observations meant something specific. He told Mark immediately. Mark recognized the risk without hesitation. He crossed to the tent and called out, loudly, directly instructing them to open the tent, increase ventilation, and shut down or move the stove. He knocked on the tent structure, physically trying to rouse whoever was inside. The response, when it came, was delayed. The voice that eventually answered was Matteo's. Matteo was coherent enough to speak, but not coherent enough to assess the situation accurately. Based on Mark's account, he told Mark they were fine and asked him not to interfere. The tone was not aggressive. It was the tone of someone who genuinely believed what they were saying, which is exactly what carbon monoxide poisoning sounds like from the inside. You feel tired and a little out of it,
but you do not feel like you are dying. You just feel like you need to sleep.
Mark did not walk away. He stayed. He kept shouting. He had Pasang maintain a watch on the tent while he got on the radio to base camp and reported suspected carbon monoxide exposure at Camp 4. He stayed as close as the situation allowed, monitoring for any sign of collapse or further distress.
But you have to understand that there is a limit to what you can do from outside a tent where the occupants are telling you that they are fine and you have no authority to forcibly enter.
Mark understood the danger. Mateo, in that moment, did not or could not. His brain was running on a system that had been steadily compromised for hours. Mateo's phone fragments recovered later included what investigators interpreted as a brief, partially typed note referencing dizziness and a faint smell described as exhaust-like and a heavy feeling that he couldn't quite shake. This is the only first-hand record of what was happening inside the tent after dark. The smell is significant. Carbon monoxide itself has no odor, but the incomplete combustion that produces it at altitude also produces other byproducts that can have a faint fuel or exhaust smell. It is not a strong smell. It is the kind of thing you might notice for a second and then rationalize away, especially if your brain is already operating at reduced capacity. Based on the fragment, that appears to be what happened. He noticed it. He didn't know what it meant. He went back to sleep. That was, in all likelihood, the last decision he made. The physiology from this point is clinical and fast. Carbon monoxide poisoning at altitude does not give you a window where you suddenly realize something is wrong and have time to act. The progression from heavily impaired to unconscious is not a dramatic event. It is just a light going out. The body stops maintaining the processes it needs to stay awake, and then it stops maintaining the processes it needs to survive, and there is no sensation that marks the transition. By somewhere between 12:30 and 1:30 in the morning, based on what investigators estimated from the rate of exposure and fuel consumption, all four of them would have lost consciousness. The stove continued running. The carbon monoxide continued accumulating. The tent held in the cold. By 4 in the morning, there was no response to calls from outside. Mark and Pasang returned at first light around 6 in the morning and entered the vestibule of the tent. What they found inside was described in the aftermath as quiet. There was no sign of struggle. Equipment was in place, as though everything had been set down and arranged before sleep. 4 people in sleeping bags, each of them in a position consistent with having fallen asleep and not woken up. The stove, the placement, the ventilation, the sleeping positions. Mark recognized the pattern immediately and completely. He radioed base camp. 4 fatalities. Camp 4, probable carbon monoxide poisoning. The Himalayan database entry that followed documented it in the spare, factual language that mountaineering records use for these things. 4 male climbers, ages 28 to 31. No Sherpa or guide support. Stove use inside tent. Reduced ventilation. No carbon monoxide detection equipment. Death window estimated between 12:30 and 4 in the morning on May 19th. Cause listed as probable carbon monoxide poisoning compounded by extreme altitude hypoxia. Classified as preventable with standard expedition safety practices.
That last line, preventable. I want to sit with that for a second because it is not a judgment. It is a technical assessment, and technical assessments on Everest are currency.
It means that the tools to survive that night existed. A CO detector, vestibule, stove placement, maintained ventilation despite the cold. Any one of those things, applied correctly, changes the outcome.